What do you think makes a monster truly terrifying? Is it sharp fangs, supernatural powers, or is it something deeper? Something that taps into our fundamental fears of death, disease, and the corruption of everything we love. The original vampire represented all these things, but over time they lost all their horrifying qualities and they got reduced down to somebody hot who lives forever. To understand how vampires went from rotting, horrifying corpses into romantic heroes, we had to start at the beginning. And I mean the very beginning. In the tombs and graves of people from the past, where the very first vampire stories were born from very real horrors. In medieval Europe, death was a mystery no one truly understood. When communities faced mysterious deaths or plagues, they sometimes turned to a desperate solution: digging up the recently deceased to look for answers. What they found would give birth to centuries of nightmares. I mean, just imagine being one of these gravediggers. The body you unearth is bloated, with blood-like fluid seeping from its mouth. The skin is retracted, making it seem like hair and nails had grown after death. When you pierce the corpse, you hear moaning sounds. Just decomposition gases escaping, but in that moment, it seems like it's something utterly unnatural. These weren't just stories, these were real experiences that shaped how people understood death itself. Across the ancient world, cultures developed their own versions of vampires, each with their own local fears and beliefs tied into them. In ancient Mesopotamia, they had the Ekamu, spirits of people who died violently or were left unburied. They were particularly terrifying because they represented a fate that could happen to anyone. Dying far from home without proper burial rites would continue to eternal hunger. These spirits would attack travelers in the desert, possessing them and driving them mad with unquenchable thirst. A fear that made terrible sense in a desert civilization where dying of thirst was a very real threat. The Chinese Qiangxi evolved from an even more practical concern: the need to transport bodies over long distances for burial in their hometown. Professional corpse transporters would travel at night, carrying multiple bodies in a single file line. When seen from a distance in the moonlight, these bodies might appear to be hopping. Over time, this evolved into more complex mythology. The Qiangxi were created when a soul failed to leave its body properly, resulting in a stiff corpse that hopped with its arms outstretched. Though they didn't drink blood. Instead, they drank the life force, or the qi, from their victims. Traditional Chinese architecture even evolved to defend against them. Spirit walls were built outside doors because Jiangxi could only move in straight lines and couldn't navigate around obstacles. All of these cultures had their own versions of vampires, but in Europe, the handling of these ancient fears was about to change dramatically. In the 1730s, something unprecedented happened. Vampires would step out of folklore and into official government documents. The Great Vampire Panic of the 18th century marked the first time in history that vampires were investigated by medical professionals, military officers, and the representatives of the Enlightenment establishment. It all began in the village of Kisilova, in Serbian territory then controlled by the Habsburg Empire. A local farmer named Peter Plugojewicz died of an apparent illness, but he didn't stay dead. 3 days after his death, Peter returned from the grave, appearing before his son demanding food. Apparently the whole dying thing makes you hungry. His son fed him, but the next night when Peter returned asking for more, his son refused, and Peter left, but not before giving him a menacing look. The next morning, his son was found dead, and a few days later, 9 more people were as well. Before their deaths, each of these villagers complained of exhaustion and appeared to have lost large amounts of blood. If that wasn't suspicious enough, each had reported they had been visited by Peter in their dreams before falling ill. Now, this wasn't unusual. Vampire cases were very common in the region. What made this case different is what happened next. The villagers demanded to exhume Peter's body. Under Habsburg law, this required official permission. The local imperial administrator, Austrian official Frumbald, was sent to oversee the exhumation. A mostly rational man, he expected to calm local superstitions. Instead, he wrote a detailed report describing something that disturbed him deeply. The body, after 40 days in the ground, showed minimal decay. Fresh blood appeared in its mouth, and the skin and nails appeared to have grown after death. And most disturbingly, when a stake was driven through the body, it reportedly groaned and bled capitiously. Frumbald's official report, written in detached bureaucratic language, caused a sensation when it reached Vienna. But it was the case of Arnold Pauli that would transform local vampire incidents into international phenomena. Arnold was a Serbian hajduk, a kind of mercenary that fell off a wagon and died in 1727. Kind of a random way to go, but who really gets to choose, right? Before his death, he claimed that he was bitten by a vampire while serving in Greece. Within a month of his death, 4 people in his village died after complaining they were being haunted by his ghost. The imperial authorities sent a team that included 2 military officers and a regimental medical officer. Their investigation was thorough and scientific by 18th century standards. They interviewed witnesses, documented symptoms, and performed examinations on the bodies. Their report, published in 1732, described Arnold's corpse as still having fresh blood still in the veins and growing hair and nails. The reports were translated and sent all across Europe in newspapers and medical journals. The Pauli case sparked what we call now the Great Vampire Panic. Scientific academies debated. The Roman Catholic Church was forced to take an official position on vampires. Even Voltaire wrote about the cases, though he used them to mock persistent superstition in an age of reason. The panic highlighted a fascinating tension in Enlightenment Europe. Just as rational science was supposedly triumphing over superstition, educated people were seriously debating the existence of vampires. Medical doctors were proposing theories about how corpses could remain preserved or seemingly feed on the living. Some suggested that premature burial might be the cause of vampire cases, and others proposed that it could be some diseases that slow decomposition. This period also saw vampire belief begin to split down the class line. The educated classes increasingly viewed vampire stories as just peasant superstitions, even as they themselves were debating real cases in scientific terms. Little did they know that the wealth of a vampire and many aspects of its lore were about to change. As the 18th century drew to a close, vampires began to move from peasant graves into aristocratic drawing rooms. The first step in this transformation came from an unexpected source: a young English doctor's strange dream he had by Lake Geneva. John William Polidori was serving as personal physician to Lord Byron in 1816 when he participated in the famous ghost story concept that also produced Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. His contribution, The Vampire, published in 1819, introduced something entirely new: the aristocratic vampire. Polidori's Lord Ruthven was everything the bloated peasant vampires weren't. He was elegant, seductive, and easily moved through high society. Based partly on Lord Byron himself, Ruthven represented a different kind of predator, one that didn't just destroy bodies, but also souls. This is a crucial shift. The vampire was no longer just a creature of physical horror, but of moral corruption. This transformation continued with James Malcolm Rymer's Varney the Vampire. Originally published as a series of penny dreadfuls, Varney was a complex character who struggled with his own nature, sometimes seeking to end his cursed existence. This was the first hint at the tortured vampire hero who would later become popular. Then came Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which added new layers of psychological complexity to vampire mythology. Carmilla was a female vampire who formed an intense emotional and arguably erotic relationship with her intended victim. The story explored themes of forbidden desire and repressed sexuality that would become essential to vampire literature. But it was Bram Stoker's Dracula that would forever change vampire mythology. Stoker's genius was in combining the aristocratic vampire with the ancient folklore while also combining the Victorian anxieties of the time. Count Dracula was both a sophisticated nobleman and a primal horror. He could quote real estate law one minute and then crawl down the castle wall like a lizard the next. Dracula embodied multiple Victorian fears. His ability to purchase property in London and blend into society reflected anxieties about foreign infiltration. His corruption of virtuous Englishwomen spoke to fears about sexuality and moral decay. His parasitic feeding on the lower class represented concerns about aristocratic exploitation. Even his journey from east to west tapped into fears of reverse colonization. The novel was also remarkable for its use of modern technology at the time. The heroes used typewriters, phonographs, and telegrams to fight Dracula, yet they also used crucifixes and communion wafers. The early 20th century saw vampires make the leap to film. F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu gave us Count Orlok, who maintained some of the horrifying physical characteristics of folklore vampires while adding new psychological dimensions. The film also introduced the idea that sunlight could destroy vampires. As the 20th century progressed, vampires began to transform again. The Universal and Hammer horror films, particularly those starring Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee, emphasized the vampire's aristocratic nature and sexual appeal. These interpretations moved further from the horror of decay and more to the themes of immortal romance and forbidden desire. Then came a revolution in vampire fiction. In 1976, Anne Rice published Interview with a Vampire and everything changed. For the first time, we heard a vampire story from a vampire perspective. Louis and Lestat weren't just monsters. They were complex beings struggling with existential questions about morality, immortality, and the nature of good and evil. They questioned authority, struggled with their sexuality and gender identity, and grappled with the moral implications of their existence. They were beautiful and damned, powerful yet tormented. This combination proved irresistible to readers who saw in vampires a metaphor for their own feelings of alienation and desire for transformation. In the 1990s, vampires became even more humanized. Television shows like Forever Night and Kindred the Embraced presented complex vampire societies with their own politics and moral codes. Buffy the Vampire Slayer gave us Angel, a vampire cursed with a soul who fought against his own nature out of love. The trend reached its apex though when Stephanie Meyers came out with Twilight in the early 2000s. These vampires were almost completely divorced from their horrific origins. The Cullens were more like superheroes than monsters, beautiful, moral, and devoted to protecting human life. They sparkled in sunlight rather than burning, attended high school rather than haunting graves, and struggled with family dynamics rather than bloodlust. But as vampire romance began to flourish, something interesting happened. Some creators started to pull vampires back towards their horrific roots. Modern vampire horror often focuses on systemic collapse and institutional failure. 30 Days of Night presented vampires as pure predators again, intelligent but utterly inhuman. The Strain presented vampirism as a virus, tapping into fears about global disease and outbreaks. Justin Cronin's The Passage combined vampire horror with post-apocalyptic fiction. The return to horror accelerated as society's anxiety shifted. In an age of climate crisis, pandemics, and social upheaval, romantic vampires begin to feel less relevant. These stories suggest that the real horror isn't the individual vampire, but the systems that allow them to flourish. The Nosferatu remake by Robert Eggers promised to strip away centuries of romantic veneer and return to pure horror. And in my opinion, that's exactly what it did. Not everyone will love it. It's more of a slow burn movie, but I got exactly what I wanted from it. A disgusting, decrepit creature that preys on people not because it has to, but because it wants to. Throughout the revolution, vampires have served as mirrors for society's fears and desires. They began as explanations for death and decay in an age without scientific understanding, and they evolved into metaphors for aristocratic exploitation and foreign corruption with a touch of forbidden desire and external love. But what do vampires represent to me personally? In a word, trauma. I mean, think about it. Vampires exist in a perpetual state of emotional and physical turmoil, trapped for eternity. They feed off everyone around them, even those they care about most deeply, desperately trying to recapture some shadow of their former life. This theme is all over Nosferatu. While I can't say whether Eggers intended it, Ellen's story plays out like that of one of a trauma response victim, specifically sexual assault. Without diving too deeply into spoilers, we see this unfold with Ellen in her nightmares. She repeatedly tries to warn others about the malevolent presence haunting her, only to be dismissed until they experience it themselves. Even Thomas and Friedrich, despite their genuine care, don't believe her until it's far too late. Count Orlok's presence and even the trauma itself spreads from Ellen to her immediate circle to Germany itself. It took me a little bit to come to the conclusion I came to about Nosferatu, but all in all, I enjoyed the movie and I want to see it again. Vampires remain as one of our most fascinating monsters. They've evolved with society for centuries and will continue to until the end of time because they reflect our fears and our anxieties. We may not fear them the same way that our ancestors did, but there's no doubt denying the very real human fear that went into their creation and their mythology. I hope you found this deep dive into vampires as fascinating as I did, and if you like this video, like and subscribe. It helps me know that you like the video and that you want to see more. If you want to suggest a topic for a future video or you just want to say something to me, you can put it in the comments or all my socials are down below. And as always, in case I don't see you, good morning, good evening, and good night.